We're going to take a look at how do we divide when there's decimals in our dividend or our divisor. So basically that means how do we divide when we're dividing with a decimal or dividing into a decimal. Now when I'm dividing with money, I usually like to just ignore the decimal point at first because I know with money I'm always going to have two numbers after the decimal point. So remember, when I set up my problem, the bigger number always goes inside the house. So when I solve it, I'm really getting rid of my decimal point. Now I can go through and use partial quotients to try and solve my problem. So for example, I know 5 times 7 is 35, so I'm going to do 700 to get 3,500 and subtract. And then say, well, 5 goes into 65. I'm not sure, but maybe 10 times would be 60. Oh, sorry, 50. And 15 left over, and that's 3 times. So when I add that all up, I get 713. But remember, I was talking about money, so now I need to place my decimal point. So it's $7.13. So with money, it's a little bit easier because, like I said, you always know you need your decimal point and then 2 digits after because you're dividing money. Let's take a look at this one. Same thing. The 3 goes on the outside, and the first number goes inside the house. I'm going to ignore my decimal at first because it's money and it makes it a little bit easier. So now I can go ahead and solve the problem. So when I solve, I add up everything at the end. I get 416, but again, I'm talking about money, so I know my decimal point needs to go 2 spots, so it's $4.16. When we're not dealing with money, it's a little different. But the first step always is to set up your problem. So I have 0.6 going into 18. When we work with decimals, it's so much easier to just not have a decimal when you're dividing. So the rule is you can move the decimal however many spaces you want to get rid of it as long as you do the same thing to the other number. So here's what I mean. See how this has 0.6 or 6/10? I need to get rid of that decimal point right there. So what I want to do is move it over here 1 spot. If I move that 1 spot, I also have to move the decimal over here 1 spot. I know what you're thinking. There wasn't originally a decimal there. But you can always put a decimal at the end of a whole number. Now, if I made a scoop, I have to fill it up, so I have to put my 0. So my new problem is how many times does 6 go into 180? And then I just solve as I was before. At the end, I don't have to put in a decimal point. I already took care of the decimal point when I moved it. Once you move it, you forget it. You're done with it. Let's take a look at this one. I set up my problem. And if it helps you, start right away by putting that decimal point at the end of the 18. Now I have to move my decimal spot so that I don't have any decimals when I'm dividing. So I'm going to move it 1, 2, 1, 2. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So my new problem is 6 into 1800, 1,800. Because I was able to move it 2 spots, this just became a 6. I had to move this 2 spots, it became 1,800. Now I solve the same way I've been solving, so that I get my answer of 300. And remember, I don't need to put a decimal point back in, I already took care of it. For this one, once I set up my problem, I'm going to say I need to move this decimal 1 spot, so that means I need to move over 1 spot, fill up my scoop, put a 0. I like to rewrite my problem so it's easier to see. But then I just solve how many times does 9 go into 2,340, and that's my new problem. So I solve as normal, and then at the end I write down my answer, and I'm done. Let's take a look at this one. It's the same numbers as the last problem we had, but this time both numbers have a decimal point in them. So I'm going to start the same way I always do by writing out my problem. And then just like before, I can't divide by a decimal. It's just messy. Let's get rid of it. So I'm going to move this over 1 spot. If I move that one over 1 spot, I have to move the other one over 1 spot. So this time I didn't need to put a 0 because there was a number there already. So now I say how many times does 9 go into 234, and that's my new problem. I don't have to do anything else. So when I solve, my answer is 36. I always start by setting up my problem so that it's easier to see what I'm doing. Now when you're dividing by a whole number into a decimal, I don't really need to move my decimal spot over here because I'm dividing by a whole number, so that's actually okay. So now I know what you're thinking. Well, then this gets a little bit more confusing. But imagine if I put a dollar sign here. Is it confusing anymore? Not as much, because if I think of it like money, I can just divide into this the same way I had been, and then just put my decimal back in at the end. I'll show you what I'm thinking. So if I said 4 times 60 is 240, again, I'm just kind of ignoring my decimal point right now, and then 4 times 8 is 32, well, I get 68. What would we do if it was money? Well, we'd say we know we need 2 decimal spots for the money, so guess what? It becomes 0.68. So a lot of times, if I'm dividing by a whole number, and I don't need to move my decimal, I just pretend this is money and keep dividing. So here's your tricks for dividing decimals. If it's money, ignore the decimal, place it back in after. It makes it a lot easier to think of it that way. 2, you don't want to divide by a decimal ever, so you have to move the decimal point. Just be sure to move it the same amount of spaces on both numbers. And number 3, when you're dividing by a whole number into a decimal, think of it like money again and place it in after. If you follow these tricks, dividing by decimals will be really easy.